Welcome, everyone, to episode 23 of Redesigning Cities, the Speedwell Foundation Talks at Georgia Tech. Today's episode, Redesigning Cities with Affordable Housing, brings us two complementary perspectives of how we got into today's housing crisis and how we hope to get out of it. More on our speakers in a moment. First, let me introduce myself. I'm your host, Ellen Dunham-Jones, professor in the School of Architecture, where I direct the MS in Urban Design here at Georgia Tech. Check out our previous episodes on a wide range of topics on our website. We post videos of the event to both the Redesigning Cities and the Georgia Tech School of Architecture's YouTube channels, and we post edited podcasts to all the major podcast platforms. Contact us if you'd like to be put on our mailing list. I'd also like to encourage everyone, before I introduce today's event, just encourage all of you on Blue Jeans to post your questions throughout the talk in the Q&A on the right side of your screen. You're welcome to use the event chat for comments and saying hi to friends, but we will only be moderating the Q&A for questions. Please like any questions from others that you especially would like to see addressed. Those of you watching on Instagram Live are also encouraged to post questions there. Our assistants will migrate them into the Blue Jeans Q&A. And we heartily encourage you to follow us and the speakers on social media. If you hear something you'd like to share today, please tweet it at Redesign Cities. Coming up, we'll restart the series next spring. Please save the date for a special Redesigning Cities talk on February 2nd in collaboration with the National Association of Olmsted Parks, celebrating Olmsted's 200th birthday. We generally avoid focusing on Atlanta projects, preferring to bring in experts from outside our home base to help us inspire thoughtful change here. However, Atlanta's innovative Beltline Trail and investment in major new forest preserves are deserving of national attention. Episode 24, Atlanta's Parks and Greenways as Agents of Urban Transformation, will feature presentations by Clyde Higgs, President and CEO of the Beltline, and Tim Keene, the city's Director of Planning. Adrian Benepe, President and CEO of the Brooklyn Botanical Gardens, will then lead a conversation on how these projects build on the city's Olmsted legacy and are radically transforming development patterns and trip modes. Now, today, I am very grateful to Andrew Ross and Shelley Patisha for agreeing to teach me about the many complex drivers factoring into what Andrew calls the failure of American housing. This is a public conversation we all need to pay attention to. And most of the headlines about the affordable housing crisis focused on the middle class being squeezed out of high-wage cities like San Francisco and New York. But it's so much broader than that. And many of us have been trying to figure out where the housing of last resort actually is and what it looks like. We know from Andrew's book that a minimum wage earner can afford a one-bedroom apartment in only 145 out of 3,143 counties in America. So where are minimum wage earners living? And why is this the case? And what can we do about it? Shelley Patisha will lead the conversation with Andrew Ross and bring her deep knowledge of federal housing policy to the discussion. Holding the number 3 job at HUD during the Obama administration, she inaugurated and led HUD's Office of Sustainable Housing and Communities and coordinated solutions for housing with those for transportation and the environment. Some of this built on her experience as executive director of the Congress for the New Urbanism. Today, in her role as chief climate strategist at the Natural Resources Defense Council, her work sits at the intersection of affordable housing and climate change. Andrew Ross, well, it's hard for me to summarize Andrew's bio. It's probably as hard for me to summarize Andrew's bio as it is going to be for him to summarize his new book in just 15 minutes. Andrew is professor of social and cultural analysis at New York University, a contributor to The Guardian, The New York Times, The Nation, and Al Jazeera. He is also the author or editor of more than 25 books. A scholar and iconoclast, of particular relevance today is how his work delves into issues of labor as well as urban and suburban studies. Small matter of disclosure, Shelley, Andrew, and our paths intersected 22 years ago when he published The Celebration Chronicles: Life, Liberty, and the Pursuit of Property Values. The book was based on his year living in the Disney-owned new urbanist New Town south of Orlando. His new, just published book, Sunset Blues: The Failure of American Housing, revisits celebration and its surroundings. Andrew, please take it from here. I'll stop sharing and invite you to share your screen.
Thank you so much, Alan. It's a real pleasure to be here and to be able to have this conversation with Shelley. I'm gonna try and share my screen then. All right. So this book, the big backdrop is the book is about the national housing crisis, which was a crisis before the pandemic and is now an emergency because we've seen, housing prices soaring, rents heading in the same direction. The eviction moratoriums are over, and millions are now, facing evictions. So it's an emergency. Zillow has predicted that by the end of this year, the average American renter will be paying at least 30% of their income on housing, which, by federal definition makes them cost burdened. And in the neck of the woods where I am right now, I'm in Osceola County in Central Florida. It's less affordable than New York City. And in fact, the book itself is about this particular region. I decided to look at the national housing crisis through the lens of Central Florida for a number of reasons. Next, please. It's next. Central Florida at the time that I was doing my reporting was number one, the least affordable place in the country for low-income populations. And it's an area I'm familiar with quite well. I used to live here when I lived in Celebration. And I decided to focus on Osceola County because it's the poorest county in Central Florida. It's one of the fastest growing counties in the nation. And it's mostly a dormitory for workers in the tourist industry regionally. So the challenges here are particularly acute. And as Alan said, most of the media coverage of the crisis has been on the big center cities. But we've seen poverty levels rising most rapidly beyond the urban fringe. And that's where the challenges are really the greatest. Next, please. This is the main drag in Osceola County, Route 192, which is where my reporting was from. Next, and it's a very unlovely commercial strip. Next, unless you're interested in vernacular architecture. Next, some wonderful examples of vernacular architecture here. Next. So the book is broken into 6 parts, and I basically look at 6 different stops on Route 192, and each of them is a lens through which you can look. Each of them has national dimensions to it, although the story is local. It scales up nationally. There's a vacation home cluster at the western end. There's a Disney World land empire to the north of the county line. There are a lot of permanent occupants of budget motels on this strip, which is the 3rd station. There's the relatively affluent town of Celebration, which is number 4. There's tent encampments in the woods just off the strip, number 5. And off the screen here is the eastern end of the county, which is largely undeveloped, where the Mormon church is planning to build a new city for 500,000 people, very environmentally fragile land. Next, please. So my point of entry was through Celebration, where I lived more than 20 years ago and wrote the Celebration Chronicles. And I promised my neighbors I would return after 20 years because new towns need some time to mature. So I very dutifully did that and checked in with some residents I knew, very quickly fell down the rabbit hole of small town politics. And then I realized I had to really report on the main story in town next, which was the sale of the town center next, by the Disney company to a private equity firm next. And it's a firm that really was only 2 years old and had no prior experience of managing large properties like this. So it was a very mysterious sale. But the private equity firm did what private equity does all over the country. And we know these firms have really penetrated housing markets all over the country. They sold off some of the assets. They loaded the property up with debt. They drained off equity through refinancing. They jacked up the rents. They basically squeezed revenue out of the asset, and they did a very poor job of managing and maintaining the properties. Next. So this story is familiar. In fact, keep on going. Next. This story is familiar to communities across the country where poor maintenance has produced housing distress, and it was particularly distressing to find this in the center of Celebration, which is very much a new urbanist showpiece. Next. And one of the differences is that residents fought back in Celebration. The really feisty downtown condo residents, led by these two tireless and fearless ladies, Cookie and Laurel, fought a long and bitter legal battle with the Wall Street landlord, and they're only just getting a settlement right now. But that's the main story I tell in the book about Celebration. But of course, it has national dimensions. Usually, private equity targets low to mid-income housing. It doesn't really go after affluent housing markets. So Celebration was exceptional in that regard, but instructive as a result. Next. The other story I found was that the high school was enrolling the largest number of homeless students in the state of Florida, which again was very surprising. So I followed the students out of the city limits and found a lot of them next jacked up with their families, living in single rooms in the dilapidated budget motels on Route 192. Next. A lot of these families are multi-generational with their domestic pets, and they've become long-term occupants and essentially tenants of these motels. Next. Some of you might be familiar with this scenario from Sean Baker's film, The Florida Project. Next. I took up residence in the motels while I was doing my reporting and research. And basically, this trip was the main approach road to Disney World, which is the reason for the large concentration of motels, but they've become quite outmoded over the years. Next. This exterior corridor motel can't compete anymore in the hospitality market. And so it's the owners who've become what I call reluctant landlords have gotten into this business of long-term rentals. The corridors here, which used to have the function of just guests coming and going, have become very busy centers of social life in the motels. This one's empty, but it's often teeming with life, people hanging out, children playing, and all sorts of things going on the corridors. So for a sociologist like me, is a very rich sociality this community, because in many cases we are talking about a community. Next. The owners, next. The owners have become reluctant landlords, as I say. They profit quite nicely. However, they set the rents just below market rents for apartments. And one of the main reasons people end up living in the motels, and this is a national situation, there are millions of people living in motels all across America, somewhat less visibly than coverage has suggested. But you can find them wherever the motels have been bypassed by interstates and so on and so forth. They become a default housing option for a large portion of the American population. So the landlords take advantage of the fact that there's huge numbers of people that just don't have the lump sum to be able to put the cash up front to move into an apartment, like first and last month's rent. And that's a basic economic reality. So they end up in the motels, and they may think they're only there for a few months, but several years later they're still there, and facing eviction, obviously, in all sorts of ways. This is an eviction notice. Next. If you are in some of the motels closed down during the pandemic, if you are evicted, next, from a place like this, and that happened a lot because the eviction moratoriums didn't cover motel dwellers. You're just as likely that your next neighbors are going to be possums and alligators next, because you'll be living in the woods and tent encampments in the woods. Next, and this is a big story in my book. Next, please. Keep on going, actually. I spent a lot of time visiting the tent encampments. Some of them are well organized. Stop there, please. They're often organized around consumption choices. So there are beer camps and meth camps and heroin camps. They have self-elected leaders who run a very tight ship in many cases. And then there are loners who live outside of the clusters. Next. And Charlie, one of my characters in my book, this is his compound. And can we actually go back a little bit? I think you missed one or two. There's Charlie. He's well set up. He has his flat screen TV, his generators, his solar panels. He has a fridge, sofa set. Next. And he's been living out there for 15 years or more. A lot of these folks have rural backgrounds, so living outdoors is their comfort zone. Next. And he's quite gregarious, actually. He doesn't like living in tent clusters, but he's quite gregarious. Next. And people are always visiting. Some folks are very house proud. This is Rachel, who cleans her compound every day. Next. Next. Others, next. Others live in squalor and tend to be more nomadic and move on. Next. The logistics of getting rid of their garbage is a little too much for them. Next. And in general, I found, although I'm by no means mean to romanticize these communities, but at their best, they're run on principles of mutual aid. Where people share resources and information and cooperate in ways that they wouldn't under other circumstances. So there are a lot of lessons that I learned from visiting these communities. And of course, there are predatory acts and aggression and so on and so forth too. But an amazing level of cooperation, which I hadn't expected. And again, there's a very large population nationwide living in the woods. They really are the invisible homeless. And we were used to seeing images of, the tent cities and in central urban areas, but we don't see the woods encampments. But if you know where to look, you can find them. Next. But one of the tragedies is that while people are sleeping under the tree canopies in the woods, on any given night, there are hundreds, perhaps thousands of empty rooms and homes in the vacation home cluster at the far end of the county. Next. And Osceola County brands itself as a vacation home capital of the world. Next. And that disparity is something, you know, we're familiar with in New York, where I live, of course. There are 350,000 vacant apartment units in New York, and overseas investors park their capital here, just as they do in Miami and just as they do in Central Florida in vacation homes. It's the same class of investor. And there's no intention really of living there, but they're sucking a lot of local revenue out of the communities, and that's part of the problem. Next. Let's just keep going through these slides. Some of these homes are very lavish and opulent, as you can see, with every possible amenity. Next. Just keep going with the slides. I have a series of these. Basketball rinks, basketball courts, skating rinks, theaters, keep going, bowling alleys, and all sorts of next themed bedrooms, of course, for kids. Very elaborate, as you can see. Next. I spent most of my time actually following the cleaning crews around. As you can imagine, vast amounts of labor are mustered to clean these. McMansions is really not the word. They're beyond McMansions, actually. And they rent for several $1,000s a night. Next. Next. The fifth story is at the far eastern end of the county, which is largely undeveloped, environmentally fragile lands, biodiversity hotspots. The Mormon Church owns a huge chunk of land there. It's the biggest landowner in the state of Florida. And next, they've decided they want to develop a lot of that land. Next. And they have gotten plans approved. Next. For a very large new city for 500,000 people. And of course, environmentalists have pushed back on this. Split oak forest is a key battleground, and I'll explain why by just, if we go to the next slide, I'll show you the map here. Split oak forest is right in the middle. It's a small nature reserve, but basically the developers to the east need an expressway to go through that forest to feed into the development to the east. And that's why split oak forest has become so important. One of the stories here is about the urban growth boundaries. Many of you watching will know urban growth boundaries were introduced to contain sprawl, to preserve rural land outside the boundary, and encourage compact and sustainable building inside the boundary. Problem is, in a lot of jurisdictions, landowners outside of the boundary petition and lobby local officials very hard to expand the boundary to include their land so that they can profit from the sale. And in many ways, that's what's happened here in Osceola County. You can see how the growth boundary has expanded from the original line to 2012 line, which includes the first Mormon development of Sunbridge, and then in 2015 right out to the county line to include North Ranch, which is the site for the new city. Next. This is a site plan for North Ranch. As you can see, it's a kind of it's a linear series of urban nodes. It's not a very compact city, at least in blueprint version. Not, I think, what we would hope to see is a sustainable development. Next. Next. The last station is Disney World, which is, the largest employer in the region, the most successful land development venture in history, most profitable one at least, and in a position to set the wage floor. And income shortage, of course, is a major part of this story, has to be part of any story about affordable housing crisis. And Disney World's, the Disney company's record on housing for its employees is absolutely dismal. I tried to trace the impact of the Disney World economy on the housing markets in the region. And in particular, I follow the campaign of the Disney unions for a $15 minimum wage. Next. And this was a hard fought campaign. Next. And it was a winnable campaign. And indeed, they won the $15. And next. And that got parlayed into Florida voters voting last year for a $15 minimum for the entire state of Florida. Next. We've seen this happen across the country, of course, and it's a big wage hike for a lot of folks. In the case of the Disney workers, it's a 50% wage hike over their previous contract. But the brutal reality of it is that $15 isn't going to close the housing gap. In Osceola County, which is a poor working class county, you need at least $19 an hour to afford a small studio apartment. So obviously we need to be talking about not a minimum wage, but a living wage that is pegged to local prices. Next. That I know, and everyone listening and watching knows there are many reasons and causes for the housing crisis. It's a complex business, and there are many solutions that are out there that are being talked about. And in my conclusion, I do discuss some of those, both at the local and national level. But maybe this is something that really should be part of the conversation with Shelley. So I'm going to end there. Thank you. Sorry about the snafu.
No problem. Thank you so much, Andrew. That was fabulous. Shelley and Andrew, I look forward to listening.
Okay, great. Oh, Andrew, your book just sings to me. Some of it is just like bringing back memories, getting toured around Celebration when it was just a brand spanking new place, and the pitch that everybody was making that this was going to be like Nirvana, a new model for all development, and it is so emblematic, I think, of how insufficient letting the real estate industry guide our lives has led toward the situation that we're in. And the disconnect, I guess you can say, between this sort of approach to development, the mindset of real estate being a panacea for solving our problems, and the reality that people face every day. And I wonder if we could start really at that kind of maybe the second chapter of your book, your exploration of the motels and the motel culture was just really both inspiring and also very heartbreaking. And the fragility of people's existence. Do you think that there are solutions that could really kind of actually make those housing opportunities, that housing more livable, more stable?
Yeah, it's well, first of all, I found such a rich spectrum of humanity living in the motels. Really broad cross section of the community. You know, families that thought of themselves as solidly middle class, and they just got knocked sideways. Tourist industry workers, elderly and retirees living on thin government checks, economic fugitives from the north, climate refugees from the Caribbean, and a lot of hustlers also pushing relief from the pain and hardship. So it was an extraordinary spread. And for a lot of those folks, I mean, they spoke about being in the motels as a trap. I mean, they moved in and they were trapped there. They couldn't move out. Some of them managed to move up, just as many moved down into the woods and on the streets. But it's a normative environment for people at this point in time. So they didn't necessarily find it terribly unusual or exceptional if they've been living there for years. It was their home. They fashioned a home out of it. As for solutions, there's a lot of interest nationwide in conversions, converting these motels into housing. And there are one or two examples on the strip here in Osceola County, perfectly reasonable and good examples, much cheaper actually than building, from scratch. The county has eminent domain powers to do so, has not exercised them. There's a lot of talk in other places, even New York, they've been talking about converting hotels. And certainly in Los Angeles, I know that's been going on for a while. So that's a no-brainer in many ways, because these motels are not going to be repurposed for the hospitality market. And they can easily be converted into 1-bedroom or 2-bedroom units with just a little ingenuity and not all that much financing. The strip itself, because you really have to look at the strip itself as a form, a housing form in a sense. The strip really needs to be redesigned, and I know there are ideas out there about doing this. And I wish that Alan, who's the expert in retrofitting, would come down here and produce a plan for retrofitting Route 192. I'm going to try and arrange that. Because there's so much wasted space and retail is cratering, and there isn't the political will, of course. The political will is essential, not just at the local government level, of course, but at the state level, because, with all the best will in the world on the part of local officials, you can still get overridden by preemptive laws at the state level. And unfortunately, Florida is one of the 27 states that has these preemptive laws. So rent controls are prohibited. Inclusionary zoning is prohibited. All the tools that planners need in their toolkit to address this crisis are blocked at the state level.
But I thought that you brought up the Hope Center as a kind of community-based organization that was started out with support services for unhoused people who are in dire financial straits, and then they are starting to move into this space of being able to buy and renovate and manage these motels. It seems like that's actually sort of a way around the typical tool set that we've gotten really attached to. I mean, another kind of interesting technique that I was reading about in your book was about these motel owners who were starting to rent for 6 months instead of a week or a month at a time. And just that stability, knowing where you're going to live, maybe provides some relief for people. Do you think that there's like a movement that could start to spring up that is maybe kind of do it yourself almost?
Well, in the absence of really effective, political or government action, that is the only alternative. And unfortunately, I would say the faith-based groups like the Hope Community Centers kind of emerged from the United Methodist Church and actually the Celebration Church, which helps to fund it. They're none too happy about being left with this big burden on their shoulders, because this Tallahassee legislature in Florida is not at all interested. It's a very hard right-wing legislature, and they sweep the funds for affordable housing every year and use it to fund other operations. And again, there's not that much help at the local government level. So yes, the alternative is in civil society and among groups. And we know that the homelessness, some people refer to as the homelessness industry. A lot of the service providers are either from churches or depend on, philanthropy of one sort or another. It's a stopgap measure. They really see themselves, I think, and the Hope Center, I know, sees itself as a stopgap measure. They do what they can, and they do wonderful work. But they're doing work that would be more effectively done if there were, government solutions to this and real government action.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, I do feel that overall, with the housing crisis, we need a comprehensive solution. And the federal government should be in the business of doing that, but is unfortunately quite gridlocked and almost dysfunctional at the very moment when we really needed to step in and address the housing crisis.
Yeah, one of the most exciting projects I was able to work on when I was working at HUD was the revamp of the civil rights law accountability system.
Mm-hmm.
And it was called Affirmatively Furthering Fair Housing, and essentially said, you communities cannot be expecting to take our money if you aren't actually addressing your real housing and poverty problems.
Mm-hmm.
And it was for the first time looking regionally at the problems of where are people getting pushed to who can't afford to live near where they work or in the center city. It's just too expensive. And yet so much of the kind of housing policy that we've seen in America is very central city focused.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Unfortunately, Trump reversed that law. I think they're trying to put it back.
Yeah.
But you're right. I think we need like some fundamental accountability, and one way to do it would be to put some strings on some of the money that flows from the federal government.
Uh-huh. Yes. Well, the one thing we've seen recently, at least from the Biden administration, I mean, they have rolled out this affordable housing initiative, and the one interesting thing about it is that they want to prioritize the sale of foreclosed homes to nonprofits, community developers, and not sell them to corporate investors. In the second quarter of this year, 1 in 6 houses nationwide were purchased by corporate investors, and in some markets as much as 1 in 4. So they're really going gangbusters right now. I think everyone expected that to be a short-term play. Back in the day after the housing crash, when the Obama administration sold those foreclosed homes, and the firms would get out of the business when they were able to flip them. But that hasn't really happened. I mean, they're snapping up all classes of real estate right now, and we know that the impact on rents and prices is quite considerable. So it's a baby step, but it's a step in the right direction, and it's a step in the right direction of what's called social housing. In Europe, the term is much more current. But I think we're going to see a lot more talk about social housing now, non-market alternatives that include, home ownership options that aren't tied to the speculative market. And my feeling, walking away from Central Florida, my field site here, was that giving more sugar to developers and builders to produce housing through the existing delivery system, it hasn't worked. I mean, the record is pretty clear for decades. And so why go on repeating that formula? We need to have non-market alternatives in significant numbers for the needle really to move.
But one thing that I've also observed is that the nonprofit community can also be an industrial complex. They've gotten very tied to the low-income housing tax credits, and it forces the development of like 250 unit buildings that pretty much all look the same. And
Mm-hmm.
what I really have been thinking about, and your stories kind of get to this, is how can we promote just a much more nuanced, context-sensitive set of solutions? Small places, motels, co-ops, and traditional affordable housing.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I think one of the things that, like, you and I were talking about as we were getting prepared, is just the lack of capacity in many communities, particularly these big, sprawling suburban places, the lack of community of capacity from both maybe nonprofit housing developers. I don't know if there are any that are in this region, but also the advocates who could be pushing more for more change in the policies.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
What did you find? What did you find in Central Florida about the kind of nonprofit sector?
Yeah, it's well, I have a lot to say about that. I'll try and be brief. First of all, there have been a lot of studies done of the impact of short-term rentals on rents, or the impact of Airbnb. I wasn't in a position to do that, but I did find that the builders and developers who are here were fatally attracted to the vacation home product, very profitable for them. They were not interested in building more affordable kinds of product, the missing middle. And so so the short-term rental clusters did have an impact on the housing market, not by displacing people necessarily the way Airbnb is done, but through through being particularly lucrative for the builders and developers. And there's a lesson there, I think. It's not a market failure; it's the market working in that respect.
Yeah.
The non-market alternatives have really a lot of trouble getting off the ground, in part because most local elected officials either come out of the real estate industry and are going to return there. I mean, they don't give up their day jobs. They're in the real estate industry, or they're very close to it, because real estate and tourism is everything here. So it's very difficult for them to get their heads around the idea of, community land trusts or limited equity cooperatives, or, that whole range of social housing options is out there. They do have a community land trust initiative. It's just very difficult for the county commissioners to really wrap their head around that. And they do instinctively see it as encroaching on their market monopoly. So there's some real raw power there at the local level. That said, it seems inevitable that that's a way to go. I mean, notwithstanding what you said about nonprofits often falling into that, mold and churning out the kind of cookie cutter product. I actually end the book by focusing on dwellers, thinking about if public housing programs are really going to get, revived. We hear a lot of talk about this in Capitol Hill. We have to put the dweller at the center. They can't be top-down initiatives. And
Mhm.
because we know that households come in all shapes and forms these days, there has to be a lot more variety, and dwellers have to be involved from the outset in ideas and decisions about design.
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah.
Technologically, it's perfectly capable of doing this. Would you agree?
Um, well, I totally agree with that. And I guess where I keep getting stuck is like how to kind of insert some interventions or disrupt. A lot of people talk about disruption. And um, I'm in the Washington bubble. I've
Mm-hmm.
been spending an awful lot of time with the infrastructure bill and the Build Back Better bill. This morning I was reading the programs that are being proposed around housing. Um, Maybe there's some ways that these competitive funds could be a tool for maybe starting to show or investing in these places to show different types of housing options and different
Mm-hmm.
ways of coming up with uh, solutions to what you're saying the dwellers need. Um, that was something that I found very positive when I worked at HUD. I ran a,
Mm-hmm.
a big grant program that gave urban planning and redesign grants to communities, and I'd say more than half were given to communities that were not the traditional kind of blue state places. And
Mm-hmm.
I
Mm-hmm.
still hear from
Uh-huh.
many of these folks.
Yeah.
So I do think there's sort of like a disruption strategy that we might
Uh-huh.
think about. I
Okay.
would though say like one of the things that I think is interesting about Florida also is that the labor organizers and their ability to get the minimum $15 an hour wage, I mean, that hasn't been accomplished in a lot of states, and that's a big state to have a
Mm-hmm.
statewide
Mm-hmm.
vote on.
Mm-hmm.
Um, do you see any possibility that the energy that brought the 15 Fight for 15 campaign, could that start moving toward like creating like real living opportunities for people? Or is that just so not on people's radar?
No, that's a very good question, Shelley. And in fact, last night I was talking to the president of one of the Disney unions, and they're doing very well at the moment because of the so-called labor shortage.
Mhm.
They're in a position of some leverage, and unfortunately, they're not renegotiating their contract until next year. He was hoping it would be done this year, because
Mhm.
that would be point of maximum leverage. And we were discussing how to include housing, how to
Mhm.
put housing on the table. And this is really a challenge for unions, to expand their purview beyond, wages and hours and benefits, uh,
Mhm.
to include the whole social package. And I'm going to follow up with that conversation because I think it's an interesting one. It's a paradigm of social unionism as opposed to business unionism,
Mhm.
which is only about wages and hours. But likewise, I think this is a part of the country where there's no housing justice organizers. And in center cities, in New York, the housing justice movement is going gangbusters. Really, in the big cities, it'd be really, really, really effective. But in most parts of the country, they're non-existent. By contrast, the environmental groups here are really punch above their weight and are very effective and are very well organized. And I know you're in this position now, Shelley, having moved from HUD to the NRDC, and I think you're in a good position to reflect on that and how we can how some of that organizing energy that's been very successful in the environmental field can flow into housing when we really need it right now. Maybe you can talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, I mean, one of the, I mean, I've been an environmentalist my whole life, but the sort of drive for my interests is people and cities and places where they live. And I I was just bowled over, as you say, by the savviness of the environmental movement. Um, it's able to raise palatial quantities of money.
Mm-hmm.
It's able to support and empower and train up local organizers, local organizations. And so I've been taking kind of baby steps at sort of that transfer of knowledge.
Mm-hmm.
So, like one example is that during the COVID crisis, or during COVID, we had been working with a network of women that call themselves the People's Water Board in Detroit, Michigan.
Mm-hmm.
And they had been kind of almost like what you're saying, a mutual aid society
Mm-hmm.
for people living in the kind of neighborhoods around the downtown area that had been decanted, people had moved away from. And one of the things that was coming up was that when someone couldn't pay their water bill, they would have their water turned off.
Mm-hmm.
This just triggered a whole series of actions that brought the Child Protective Services out, because if you don't have running water in your unit, you might not be a good parent. It obviously could lead to evictions because you can't pay your rent and your water bill. And we, as a national organization, partnered up with the People's Water Board and behind them, kind of came in behind them and helped provide the resources so that they could be actually paid for their time working on these issues, to like help them open doors with the local electeds, with the state electeds, with the governor's office, with the US EPA, helped like investigate and understand like what were the actual tools that could change the rules so that people wouldn't be evicted if they didn't pay.
Mm-hmm.
And it's that sort of behind the scenes support system for the advocacy network that I think more of the environmentalists could provide. I think we really could start connecting the dots and help to use our knowledge in how to make change happen, how to be effective advocates, and kind of build up and grow the network of local groups that are working, say, on housing justice. It's just that knowledge hasn't been transferred, and the resources maybe aren't there, but it is incredibly connected to our climate goals as well as housing justice goals.
Yeah. Well, that's why it's so important for you to be doing this job. And I think just one last thing before Ellen comes in. I think what you're describing is the social unionism equivalent for environmentalists of what I was talking about with the labor movement way. moving beyond the fairly narrow vision of what our mission is into something much larger.
Correct. That is so true. Yep.
No, this has been an incredible conversation, and I think I love that you're ending with, how do we really knit these things back together? So knitting together some of the skills from the environmental movement to really help truly work on equity at this scale that is so invisible, it tends to be so invisible. And Andrew, just thank you for, your reporting, your living and meeting and helping to share the stories with us of people in conversations that most of us have very little contact with, very little reference. I love the idea of re-inhabiting the hotels as more permanent housing, and I've done quite a bit of work on, just not work. I've documented quite a lot. Route 66 is along in Arizona, New Mexico. Also has got the same vintage. They were the tourist hotels, and now most of those are permanent housing for low income, often for the unhoused. And there's other places as well. But I wanted to kind of just talk a little bit. Not every place has a tourist motel, has a bunch of tourist motels of that are aging. But a lot of places have garden apartment complexes that are equally, I would say here in Atlanta, that is what we see as the sort of housing of last resort that often become, we do have a lot of folks living in motels too, but the preservation, how do we preserve existing, what is that existing affordable housing? And affordable, and maybe barely affordable or not really that affordable, but what suggestions do you guys have? What thoughts on preserving existing affordable housing?
Well, I think from a financial perspective, I can't speak so well to the art and craft of physical preservation, but from a financial perspective, the private equity story is really important, Alan, because they in the process of converting so many single family homes into rentals, they've basically taken these out of the housing inventory. I mean, these are units that would have been affordable, and they're no longer accessible. And of course, the rents are jacked up. Plus, the ways in which they're diversifying their portfolios, they're now snapping up mobile home parks in Florida and elsewhere. These are, for a huge part of the population down here, at least, these are affordable. I mean, they have been an affordable option for many, many years. And student housing and all sorts of other real estate classes are being, probably garden apartments too in Atlanta, for all I know. I would guess that corporate investors have been active there too. So someone needs to put a stop to that. And fully and properly regulate corporate investment in the housing market. We have to see housing as a social good and a need that can be financialized, because it's much too important.
I couldn't agree more. I mean, and I think the question then is, so, all right, who do we have to partner with? Shelley, you're the master of partnering, of pulling together groups. Who do we partner with to figure out the legislation to stop the private equity folks from bleeding housing dry?
That is a big job. I guess I'm sort of interested in the counter movement. So for instance, during the Obama administration, part of the Recovery Act was a program called the Neighborhood Stabilization Program. And what it would do is it would provide monies that local government or local housing authorities could buy up single family homes or the garden apartments, they could retrofit them, they could put them into permanently affordable housing category. And that was a remarkably successful program. But it challenged the status quo in some important ways. One was that most housing authorities don't like to deal with small units, just scattered site units. They want it all in one big place. And so they had to like learn different ways. Or there weren't affordable housing or housing service providers that were set up to manage the housing over a long period of time. So that's one way. I think the other thing that, okay, now that I work for an environmental organization that knows everything about the power sector, I have really gotten focused on utilities. And I was working in Memphis over the last few years, which has a major problem with disinvestment in housing and a very quickly rising housing cost market in a sort of surprising way. There's also a municipally owned and controlled utility. And these utilities have beaucoup bucks for building renovations and energy efficiency improvements and lowering the cost of utilities so that they don't have to build another power plant. They've got so much money, but the local leaders would have to like run to be on the board of the municipal utility and shape that spending pattern in a different way. So I don't know that there's a one and done kind of magic solution to this. I actually think that what Andrew portrays is this mind shift, a mind shift that housing is a human right in America, that we owe it to our people to ensure that they have the opportunity to live in stable housing. And once we start to make that mind shift, I think it creates the space for the many more different types of housing to come forward that aren't able to be monetized in the same way for corporate acquisition. And I think we need to build up the social unionism side of housing.
If we actually did simply go back to, I mean, covenants have been used primarily for bad, but if for racial discrimination, but could you put new housing under covenants that said this is not allowed to be bought ever by a corporation, by a private equity investors, at least so that anything new or that it has money, I don't know. I love thinking about some of the policy things, but we've actually got a couple of questions in the Q&A also about some of the types of housing, types of organizations. So one question is that says that Banana Kelly is a nonprofit development corporation that is adding community land trust to its model and offerings. How common is this? How promising? I know in Atlanta, our community land trust is doing very good things. I know that folks, even in some of rapidly escalating, very strong markets like Arlington County, they really wished they'd had more community land trusts to still preserve some of that absolutely middle class and what had been long been stable housing. Talk a little about land trusts.
Everyone loves the idea. I mean, every urbanist, every urbanist I know is in love with community land trusts, and And as I said, even in Osceola County, they have an initiative which actually two housing developers put together. The problem is finding a chunk of land that's big enough. You don't have to have a contiguous land mass to have a community land trust. You can have bits of it in different locations, of course, but that's it's less coherent and it's less efficient as a result. That said, there are many institutional landowners that have chunks of land. Universities, corporations, the Disney company here has, considerable amounts of land, and they could make themselves look really good by handing that land over. In fact, a big chunk of the biggest chunk of Celebration land that is undeveloped and will probably not be developed for housing is west of the I-4 freeway. That's a perfect site for a community land trust. So it's not that there aren't, parcels out there that are likely. There needs to be pressure, and that's where the housing justice movement, where it's non-existent, has to be cultivated, and that pressure brought to bear from below for that extra push. Not enough for it to come from top-down initiatives.
Yeah, I mean, I also see some interesting experimentation happening with nonprofit developers, development finance institutions, CDFIs. I worked with enterprise community partners to finance a community land trust of scattered site housing in Oakland, California. And what I saw in that was like some real rethinking by these nonprofit organizations, like how do we structure this deal? How do we do this differently? So I think maybe putting incentives out there, maybe pushing through advocacy to get more community land trusts up and operating, because I think you're right, Andrew. Like it's seen as a panacea by planners, but it's still at this very small scale.
Yeah, but there were some wonderful examples, of course. I mean, in New York, the Cooper Square Trust is right outside my office. Is a great example. And last night, I stayed with a friend in Winter Park, Florida, which is a fairly affluent community just to the north of Orlando. It has one of the best community land trusts, which has enabled the African American community there to be able to stay in the area. And I think we have to remember that community land trusts were actually pioneered by African American communities in the South. Ellen's point about repurposing the covenants is very interesting, given their history, their racialized history. Keep on coming up with initiatives like that, Ellen. I think we need to look into them.
I'll try. Another question. I mean, what about question about trailer parks, manufactured housing, tiny homes? Where do you see? Are they just in danger of being bought up by? They're obviously, Andrew, you're seeing some of those in danger of being bought up. But are they? Do you see some really good examples of those? Should we be using more of them?
Well, I think just to clarify, I think the reason why private equity firms are so interested in the mobile home parks is that they see a gap, which is very profitable, between the ground rents that are paid by the owners of the homes and a way to really jack up those rents and generate profit. So it's a very particular model, and they obviously have seen an opportunity there. and there's a certain amount of housing distress in these homes anyway. So they thrive wherever they are able to to take advantage of the distress. The manufactured housing industry and the tiny homes industry seems to be a little different, just in terms of its industrial model of production. And obviously, there's a lot of interest in that right now. And these are the affordable products. So why not?
Yeah. Another question is about going back to the land trust discussion. I think was sponsored. Do you find that people can sometimes be surprised by the output of land trusts? Atlanta has a new proposal for 42 homes. Half of them are market rate, and then the half that are more, that are subsidized are at 60 to 120% of AMI. And the writer says, it's great to see this. I don't mean to devalue the project, but he was just surprised by the low number of affordable units.
Mm-hmm.
Isn't that a function of where they're getting their money to do the projects and the return expectations of that funding source? I mean, if they have to do market rate financing for their land trust, then they're going to be stuck in this space. But you have to have a write down on the cost of the money in order to do it.
Yeah. I would assume so. I don't know. Amanda, are you on? Amanda,
but isn't the point, Ellen, that even though these prices may be high right now, the cap on the resale value is what keeps them affordable in the long run. And so those prices, which may be relatively high right now, won't necessarily be high, relatively speaking, in the future. But they'll still be affordable in perpetuity.
Well, and explain to our listeners, I mean, it seems to me that land trusts work that they really are most effective in areas where land cost is going up so high that it at least dampens by separating the cost, the accrued value of the house from the accrued value of the land. But in areas where land is really not going up so much, you're not in a super hot market, are land trusts still a useful or viable solution? Do you see them in places that are softer markets?
Well, I think that's a really good question. I don't know the answer to, but there's also a component of control. That is generally, most of the land trusts I've seen are locally controlled. So I think that's maybe an additional benefit besides the price escalation.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I think one of the topics we haven't really talked about is the ratio of homeowning to renting, and it seems to me that the rise of rentership that we've seen over the last decade is going to continue unabated, and the decline of home ownership accordingly. What does that say about the housing landscape we want? And in particular, I want to just note that the level of black home ownership in this country is now less than it was before the Fair Housing Act was passed in 1968, which is an astonishing statistic. Supposed to bar racial discrimination in housing, and here we are at back before that threshold was reached. So I wonder how either of you feel about that ratio of homeowning to renting, and whether that just the American the American habit of seeing homeowning as an engine of prosperity is sort of hollowing out in a way. I mean, it's absurd to say that in a moment when housing prices are soaring, but that's I think a temporary phenomenon.
I would like to sort of flip it back to hearing you guys. I mean, it does seem to me that our emphasis on home ownership and then our policies that only allowed whites to really benefit primarily has actually kind of exacerbated this notion that the only way to generate wealth is through your housing. I don't think my grandparents didn't make a killing on their real estate. I mean, it's not, and it's not that many generations old that one truly expected to make, to generate wealth off of your own housing. And maybe it's part of this larger discussion of that we're sort of, everybody thinks they can make all this money on housing. Well, it kind of comes back to this, the American way. But at the same time, I do look at the way that rentals in this country, they're certainly not, they don't seem to have a whole lot of concern for the public good in general with the way, but it's so interesting to look at a city like Vienna, where the majority of the population at all different income levels live in rent public housing, and they seem to generate wealth just fine in other ways. They seem to certainly live nice lifestyles in a nice city, and maybe that's just being romantic. The grass is greener on the other side, but I think that's a really good question of the rental versus home ownership. Why are we so? There are reasons, I think, why right now it is most households would rather own than rent if they can.
Yeah.
But should we be trying to change that, or I don't know?
Yeah. Well, I think what you're describing, Alan, you're thinking about your grandparents. I think that habit of seeing that their home as a second business in a way really kicks in when middle class household income stagnates, and therefore there's a dependence on resale value, and that's why houses flip so often in the U.S. in a way they don't anywhere else in the world, on such a regular basis, that people just factor that into their income trajectory or their income plan. And but that has a lot to do with the shortage of salary income and how that is stagnated for middle tier earners.
Yeah. We have a couple of questions. We're getting towards the end here, but a couple of questions that are also asking, I think, what can the cities do, and some specifics on how to really work with state housing finance agencies. So let me first say one question is, how do we work with state housing finance agencies to amend qualified allocation plans to support smaller projects? Does that language?
I totally get that. Yeah.
Okay.
So state housing finance agencies are required to put together what they call qualified allocation plans, QAPs, that show how public tax credits are going to be used in the state. And it is overseen to some extent by HUD. I think that what we've seen in this space is that these organizations actually have a lot of power to determine their future and the future of housing. So I had a whole part of my career where I was working with these housing finance agencies to embed criteria into the rules that said that you get more money or greater points if you were building housing near transit. You could also change those criteria to address, are you bringing a type of housing that's missing in this community? So that's actually a great place for activists to focus because it does actually deliver change. And it's sort of like a not well-known space, I think.
Great. Great suggestion. All right. And then now a question on what are your thoughts about how the city can activate and retrofit some of the city-owned and or controlled buildings? Should they be partnering with NGOs, organizations, development groups? Are there incentives to convert publicly owned buildings? They might be office buildings, they might be any, just buildings into affordable housing or homeless rehabilitation. Answer is yes.
Yeah.
Any
a very
advice?
good time
Any
to ask that
particular?
question. No, it's a great time to ask that question when so many office buildings are vacant, when so many hotels are vacant, and there's a lot of uncertainty about whether they'll fill up again. So there's talk about this. There's still a lack of imagination about how to do it, and that's why some really well executed examples of the sort that Shelley just imagined for us and referenced, they go a long way if they can be shown to work. But local government officials are not known for their imagination. There's in many ways the least imaginative agents on this landscape, a lot less imaginative even than builders and developers. And we spend a lot of time berating them for their, routine forms of production. So I think it's a great moment to ask that question, and the logic is certainly there. It's just a question of, I would say, political will and imagination.
Yeah,
All right, so I'm going to close out with a question on education, because that's where we are. And I would say, I'm going to totally oversimplify and probably insult everybody, but in schools, in general, the architects are kind of taught to solve affordable housing by designing existence minimum, how to just, I can make it smaller, cheaper, and more efficient, that I've solved the problem. Planners are taught about inclusionary housing and a couple policy things, and maybe to ease up on zoning restrictions. Real estate students are taught a little about the low-income housing tax credits and things. Urban designers are taught just get as much housing near transit as possible. But what are we missing? As obviously this, it's always helpful when the disciplines talk to each other and collaborate, but what are we missing as we really try to tackle this? Closing thoughts for the students and educators.
Well, I would say, certainly the interdisciplinary work that you mentioned, Ellen, is totally important. And people are bound by their professional commodities, and each of these fields is a professional commodity and a skill set and a certain kind of knowledge that's fairly narrow. It's important, but it's very narrow-minded, and we need that more of the expansive vision that I think we were speaking about earlier, the Shelley's position and her sort of career trajectory it seems to be heading in that direction, and the social unionism idea that I discussed a little bit. That's what we need much more of, and a lot of educational institutions pay lip service to interdisciplinary work. It's a selling point, it's a talking point, but really moving these institutions, which are very inertia bound, in those directions is the challenge. And I think, again, this is the moment to do it. So it's a good question, Ellen.
I think it is a really good question. And I'm kind of coming back to something Andrew said earlier, which is focusing on the dweller, focusing on the people, and really putting yourselves in the shoes of the person who is just trying to get by, and really thinking through what is going to actually meet their needs. I mean, one thing I've also realized is that, okay, so I'm trained as an urban planner. I had like a big chunk of my career was on community participation, but I'm not sure I actually learned how to listen carefully to what people want and need and have my solutions come from that. And I think that's a whole area of growth in education that I think we need to get to. Because there's also there's a disrespect, I think, that people feel when these ivory tower ideas get put down. And the more that students can really kind of build that muscle of listening and learning and being very context specific, that it will actually like improve the field as a whole.
Great comments to close on. So thank you so much, Andrew and Shelley. You've been listening to episode 23 of Redesigning Cities, the Speedwell Foundation Talks at Georgia Tech. I hope you have learned as much as I have from our amazing speakers. Come back February 2nd for episode 24, Atlanta's Parks and Greenways as Agents of Urban Transformation. Thanks very much, everybody. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.